Good evening, everyone. This is Tim Cusick. I am the Training Peaks WKO4 product leader. I want to welcome you to tonight's webinar. Tonight's webinar is called Individualizing Your Training and was specifically released for those of you this month that were transitioning from WKO plus 3. I know that this transition it's the EOL, which is end of life of the product, syncing. I see some repeat names and some people, I know Debbie posted it in the Facebook group for everyone. This webinar is a general repeat of the individualizing webinar I did about a year ago. So just be warned, it's for those who have been using the program for a year or two, there's only a couple of new additions to this. It really is meant for newer users, which I see plenty of them because I don't recognize your names in this webinar. But I do see some old-time names. Just be careful that this might be redundant. If it is, feel free to drop off or watch the recorded version. And of course, you're always welcome to stay and follow along. For everybody else, let's get started. Quick little warning. I picked up a nasty case of the flu yesterday because I haven't been sick for 3 years, and eventually you get it. So my voice and strength of voice is a little limited, and if you hear me go to mute suddenly, it's because I'm having a coughing attack and don't want to have you guys listen to it. So I apologize if that interferes here. I'll do the best I can. As we're going through tonight's webinar, particularly with a lot of the new folks, please feel free to ask questions as we go. If this is your first webinar, you'll see this little square on the right-hand side of your screen probably. It might be open or like the view that you see, or it might be closed, in which case your arrow is pointing to the left. You can simply click that to open this little UI, little user interface. And once open, you'll see one of the topics is questions. And if yours is plus and closed, just click on it to open. And here at the bottom, you can enter a question as you go. Particularly in this, for newer users, please feel free to ask questions as you go. I'll answer them as best I can. I read them. I have another screen off here where I'm actually looking at all the questions. So I keep up with them pretty well, and I tend to blend your question right into my presentation, or if I know I'm going to answer it later or something like that, I just let it ride. So that's pretty much the rules of the presentation. Please feel free. And excuse me one second. Taking one for the team tonight. I was 100% committed to not delay this webinar. Okay, let's start out about individualizing your training. Individualizing your training really starts with the modern athlete. Since most of these webinars are designed for coaches, I'm taking it from a coach approach. I know that there's some self-coached athletes on here listening along, so apologize. The modern athlete really has changed and evolved, particularly maybe in the last 5 to 7 years. With this modern athlete, science, information, and technology are playing a much bigger role. I myself, I'm 50, and I've been in competitive sports really since I was 9 or 10, but having been a high school athlete and a collegiate athlete and then carried athletics on beyond, I've really seen the transition over the years, and this dramatic acceleration of late of this modern athlete. We're so tuned in to science and information and technology, and we have access to it, meaning not only can we find devices and things that helps us get that, we can easily, through the use of the internet and other functions, find ways or basic understanding of how to use it. The reality is the modern athlete is a data generating machine. If you think about it now, and this is true in all sports, not just endurance sports, even though I believe endurance sports had a lead role in it, it really is. We are just data generating machines. What we see in this modern athlete is equipment with measurements, shoes, bikes, wearables, tracking devices, interactive, which is really becoming more and more of a hotbed. Metabolic, movement. I mean, how many devices and systems and functions are out there measuring gait or pedaling stroke, or what we're seeing, all types of new data. Environmental. There's been a new focus or a refocus on environmental data, what's happening in the universe or the area or the environment that the athlete is performing in. And what I call hyper performance data. We're getting all of this, down to hemoglobin data and all of this data that is so minute, so such a tiny part of it, yet, but it matters. What are you going to do with all of it? What is this modern athlete coming? What's it all coming to? Well, the reality is all good coaches should accept what I'm about to say. And if you're a self-coached athlete, understand you're probably already gone through this process. With all this data, the athlete is evolving. And the reality is they're becoming an individual performance machine. And if you think about it, every athlete right now, or what so many athletes, and probably any athlete on this webinar, you're actually collecting all of this real-time data, right? You're suddenly running to a pace or a heart rate or a power number. You're suddenly riding to a power target, a power zone, a power training level, an optimized level, or whatever you're looking at. You're analyzing data on the fly. More and more data is now moving into the head unit with Garmin's IQ and other factors. You're actually looking at more data. The number of people I see riding with their head down looking at that data is pretty impressive. But what you really need to understand, since that's the athlete or an individual athlete, they're looking at their individual data. So here's a good tip for all coaches, right? You might be looking at 5, 10, 20, 25 athletes worth of data, in some time frame. That's the number of athletes you're coaching. Each one of your athletes are looking at one, theirs. So the reality is the individual athlete is really becoming much more aware and in tune with their individual data. And then therefore it leads us that the modern coach needs to adapt by individualizing your coaching. I always need a good typo. Starting off with one early is good. I get it out of the way. We're done. I doubt it. Excuse me again. So really you start talking about this data-driven coaching model. And to me, this is where I really think things are going. I'm going to give you a little insight into this, but it goes beyond what, we did WKO4 because we saw this evolution of data and we really saw, wow, we better get ahead of this because there's so much stuff coming. If we don't have a software, a way to begin to use all this data at one time, we're going to have problems. The reality is the challenge of coaches in the next 5 years is to stay on the leading edge of this revolution. Or to be honest with you, you're going to be lost in it. Because the reality is athletes are collecting and looking at this data. And if the coaches don't know what to do with it and can't stay on the leading edge, the athlete's going to outpace you in knowledge here very shortly. The good news is the coaches that invest, they become the experts. And we've already seen this. One of the story after story of success using WKO4. And the funny thing is, WKO4 only gives you some amount of tools. It is a tool to do a lot of your own analytics and learning. And the reality is, it's that part where you as a coach can use your intuition, knowledge, and wisdom, blend it with these analytics, and create superior results. So, that challenge really is driving whether you like it or not. I did a conference a couple of months ago with a well-known coach who was a former yellow jersey wearer in Tour de France. Literally, I wouldn't say angry, but vehement about we don't need all this fancy new data. And then at the end of the seminar presentation, talked to me how they're losing more and more athletes later. They're losing more and more athletes to these coaches using power data. And you just wonder, here's a pretty smart guy, lots of accomplishments, been in cycling a long time. Do they connect the dots? It's what the athlete wants. So part of your learning is that. And if you're the individual athlete, I always have the same advice when I teach this: hire a coach, because the coach puts the wisdom and intelligence and learning and all these things together, coupled with analytics and data and the same stuff you might be learning, to really deliver expertise. Self-coaching, you have knowledge, but you tend to take a lot of years to build expertise. And to be honest with you, you're not as objective about you as you think you are. So when we start talking about building this modern athlete, you have to start with individualizing your training. So when I say that, you really actually, it might evolve around solving a problem you may not know you even had. And what's that problem? That problem is this. The problem is this bell curve. So, to give away a little secret, when functional when functional threshold was originally designed, and then all the original training levels around it, there was two things about them that you need to know. One, it was based on a bell curve of data, and that bell curve of data was representative of about 1,500 athletes, and it utilized the average. Well, when you start thinking about that as a whole, when you start thinking about the average, that means that the entire system was based off general functional rules. But the reality is, in these general functional rules, you have some people way over here that don't fit in the bell curve, and then clearly you have some people way over here that don't fit in the bell curve. And actually it goes a little deeper. If at the time we didn't have a lot of power data and we didn't know what it was like to ride certain events, or a crit versus a mountain bike race versus a time trial, actually a lot of it was designed in a generalized approach towards demand of the event and a generalized approach towards the ability of the rider. Now, if you've watched my other webinars, you'll see me say this, time and time again. All great coaching starts with understanding the demands of the event and the ability of the rider, and working towards matching the ability of the rider to the demands of the event to win. Well, if you start thinking about what I'm saying, you're probably thinking, well, Tim, okay, but no big deal, right? Well, the reality is, in the bell curve, you might have 50% of the universe fit here, right? Because this might only represent 25% this extreme, and this might represent only 25%. But the reality is that means 50% don't fit. And the reality is, if one of your athlete is this guy and one of your athletes is this woman, they're 100% not fitting in the bell curve, right? To them, it just doesn't work. So when we set out to develop the science behind WKO4, we wanted to do something better with that. We wanted to individualize training. So basically, we set out with a premise that we want to develop training that recognizes the unique physiology of the individual athlete, allowing for specific, highly focused diagnostic analysis, training prescription, and individualized performance analytics to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of your training. Excuse me one second. Okay, that time I got to the mute button. Cool. So how do you go about doing this? Well, first we start with understanding human performance modeling. And one of the things when we built WKO4, and for those of you who have used it, have become very familiar, and you can see the language that is in the Facebook group and stuff like that, how comfortable we've become with it. But go back, even those, and I see a couple of users, I see one or two of our beta group, so are some of our oldest users on this meeting. Go all the way back. Remember when you first started thinking about these principles, or if you're just starting to use it now and you only have the idea of performance modeling as FTP, right? One of the things we really wanted to do in WKO4 was to give you a much better individual 360-degree view. And to do that, we had to build a unique human performance model. So what is human performance modeling? It's data-driven development and application of predictable, reliable, and executable quantitative models of human performance. I was in a meeting today with Andy and Dean Golich and Ryan from Best Bike Splits, and we were talking about this, and Andy said something, really insightful about models. When you really look at it, the model might be a little bit off, but at least it's objective. Way more often is the person being off subjectively is worse. So the model really is a data-driven quantitative model of human performance, and it's an objective model. It doesn't care if you want to go faster or if you trained a lot and it's just not working out. It kind of tends to always tell you the truth, which is one of the struggles we've had with introducing a human performance model. But the reality for people to understand this is it's an evolution. It's the lab versus the math, right? And the old school is everything happened in a lab. So I'll give you one example here, and then we'll look through some numerous as we start getting into it. I'll give you a little deeper, but the reality is, so let's take a classic measurement you go into a lab for. So you can go into a lab and you get a VO2 max test. And a VO2 max test gives you excellent insight into performance. Actually, it gives you excellent insight into performance capability and what you're capable of. If you take a VO2 max test in a lab, you come out, you get a excellent printout, you get a lot of information, more beyond just your VO2 max, why it can be worth doing. But then you have that one printout. And then if you train, you don't really know, right? You have to go back to the lab. Maybe if you had access to a lab every week, you could measure things, but your reality is, it's expensive and you can only do it once. Now, we in WKO4 can estimate your VO2 max. We have a model based off the power duration model for estimating VO2 max. Our estimate is accurate and it's been measured accurate within 3 to 8%. And you might go, well, wait a minute, that's a pretty high range of error. So now Google search how much error a lab VO2 max test has. And typically that's about 5 to 8%. So the reality is the model is generally as accurate as the lab. People just don't understand, quite that tightness of accuracy. And you're seeing this happen in so many ways. Things are evolving out of the lab into human performance modeling, and it's becoming functional. So when Andy first came up with functional power and all the ideas behind it, an FTP, the theory was to give you something just by using a power meter you could use every day on the road. Now it's evolving by using these models to give us data and metrics we can use every day just by analyzing that power data we're deriving every day on the road or in your run. Common endurance models, I'm not going to go deep into this, but you really have three of the Bannister, Busso, Coggin. These are my own opinion, by the way, the three. Bannister really kicked it off. Busso refined it because there were some model flaws in the Bannister model. It was good, but it didn't deal with some recovery and some other stuff and things well. And then, but Busso's model was very complex. Andy came around and said, let's make it more functional. Let's just simplify the Bannister model instead of making it more complex, and developed functional, what we would call the functional science here. These models have a flaw. The largest functional flaw is that all models assume a single value for representation of the adaptation to performance. So all the old models have that flaw. So in practice, different types of adaptation occur at different rates. Coggin's model, when we started looking at it, we realized we could do something. One, unintended consequences. To be fair, it was intended. We just didn't know if we could do it when we started. And the unintended consequences was to get people to stop thinking about things in this way. So how big is your FTP? So one of the things that we were really trying to solve, and then I'm going to kind of jump into the model metrics and stuff like that here. One of the things that we really wanted to solve was we had noticed when Andy put out FTP and then training levels all based on a bell curve, even training levels were meant to be descriptive, not prescriptive. The reality was that it immediately made everybody focus on FTP, and then suddenly everything became about how to find easier ways to estimate FTP. How do I make it look higher? And everybody became very focused on how big is their FTP. And the reality is that occurred. And then, we had this science, we based off that. As people just focused on FTP and drove it as high as they can, all these training levels were simply a percentage of that FTP. So as we changed maybe the way we trained to try to make that FTP number better, we might have actually been negatively impacted. As a matter of fact, I say that with irony. We were negatively impacting. Now in hindsight, having seen what happened, we are negatively impacting the way we trained by that desire, or the reality is we only had a single point of reference, FTP. So the power duration curve brings us to a new beginning. This is the power duration curve at a PD at a the power duration curve out of WKO4. This is kind of a wonky one, but you're simply seeing the simplest way to see this when you look at it is think about you have a measured result, which is your mean maximal power curve, and then you have a modeled result, which is your power duration curve. The power duration model has multiple outputs, meaning it creates more than one metric, and that gives us the ability to define, diagnose, and track performance in a 360-degree format, which I'm about to explain. And as a robust model of the athlete power duration relationship, it gives us the ability to prescribe and track training intensity that fits the individual, not the curve. So what does that look like? Well, let's talk about the 360-degree athlete, no longer defined by FTP alone. So we went out and we created a group utilizing WKO4, which is kind of cool, and its analytic power. We utilized the model, and the model was driven by this desire, so don't get me wrong, to create a series of new metrics. So pre-power duration model, we tended to look at one metric when we did most of our functional training. WKO3 only gives you one metric to work with. Training Peaks only gives you one metric to work with. The power duration curve and WKO4 gives you a few more. We actually give you a total right now, and there's more that we could count in this because you do get things like VO2 max, muscle fiber, content. There's all types of additional items, but going on in this classic idea of metric, you get Pmax, FRC, mFTP, stamina, TTE, and all of these sort of feed off of a phenotype. So let's go through what these are and how to use them. So phenotype or auto-phenotyping, and it's on, I should actually have a show of this, but you've probably already noticed when you see your athlete name in the left-hand Explorer, it says, you know, Tim Cusick, old and fat. Now it says Tim Cusick sprinter or all-arounder or TTer, right? Whatever it is, that's your phenotype. And you could use phenotype in reports and stuff like that too, or if you want. Phenotype is simply the objective classification of an athlete into one of four. For now, we're always working on, we're continuing to work on more phenotypes based on the overall shape of their power duration curve. So it's based on the overall shape of the power duration curve. And basically, you might have power duration curves that look like this. So a sprinter has a high Pmax and kind of a deeper decline. They tend to fall off their ability to sustain power. A TTer, on the other hand, has lower power, lower Pmax, but tends to hold power better over time. And then an all-arounder and a pursuiter or something in between. Now, you might be a sprinter phenotype that only has a 600-watt sprint or a 200, this isn't watts, this is power as a percentage of FTP. It doesn't mean you're a great sprinter. It probably means you're an okay sprinter at best, but it just is the shape of your curve. And all it's doing is classifying you with people of similar shape, because this matters, because it gives us some insight into muscle fiber type, energy system performance, fitness. It can change, it should shift slightly with training, but it gives us insight into the type of rider that is, and that's simply done automatically, and it will always show up next to the athlete's name in the left-hand Explorer, and it can be used as an expression. Now let's dig into the metrics. So let's start with Pmax. Pmax is the maximal power that can be generated for a very short period of time. Units are watts or watts per kilogram. The maximum power over at least a full pedal revolution with both legs. So why don't we just say max power or 5-second sprint, right? Because that's kind of what we're used to using. Well, max power is also often very spiky and buggy, particularly people who've used WKO4 where we don't smooth data. You see it. You see that 1-second power often can be very misleading. There's all kinds of things that can go wrong in 1-second power. The reality is by the time you hit a 5-second power, you're fatiguing and you've lost a little bit of power. So what we basically do to make sure it's smooth and accurate is it's counting at least the maximum power for at least one full pedal revolution for each leg. That's the appropriate balance, and it's, you know, to develop your Pmax or your maximal power potential. So that gives us, and it relates to other metrics, which I'll explain in a little bit, but the reality is Pmax is a max power output. That's not a 1 second max, so it might be a little lower than your 1 second max, but it also is a little higher than your 5 second max. So Pmax, that gives us a very clean generation of the number. Pmax standards, this is based off our database, so we do have a decent amount of pros in our database, so our database tends to be a little high. We are doing some work with the Training Peaks database to try to find some more norms, and we'll give you some updates on that in the future. So if you look at the range of Pmax for men and women, I'm not going to read these out loud. Oh, by the way, if you click that same little arrow button I showed you to ask questions, there's a section called handouts towards the bottom. If you open that, I put this handout there for you as a PDF, so you have these sheets so you don't have to take screenshots. So the range here you see, I'm not going to read them all, but you see the range for men and women. And the medium range for Pmax is 993 watts to 1509 watts for men, and for the medium, and for women 677 to 989. I would say in the real world these numbers are a tad high. Our database is a little bit pro heavy, but you know, we're working more and more towards some profiles, but understand we're going to use these metrics to measure the individual. Next we have functional reserve capacity. Functional reserve capacity is the total amount of work that can be done during continuous exercise above FTP before fatigue occurs. Units are kilojoules or joules per kilogram. Now the reality is it's continuous exercise. So whenever whenever you sprint or go hard or go over threshold, let's just say, so above FTP, a lot of times we all associate threshold, right, with lactate. And we say, well, that's when the point where we can't sustain, you know, we can't get rid of the lactate that we're building. We're building more lactate than we can deal with. That's true, but it really is part of the mix. It's not the absolute driver. As a matter of fact, the fatigue comes from other factors of ions and pH and things that happen chemically. Lactate is just something easy to track in there. But what's really happening is you're having a transition of energy systems. So you can make energy aerobically or anaerobically, and there's some transition between the both. There's a point where you're competing actually for glycogen resource. The reality is once you go anaerobic and you're making energy anaerobically, i.e. in the absence of oxygen, that can only last so long, right? So it's the total amount of work that can be done during continuous exercise over FTP. So we have the ability to measure how big that battery is. So if you look at WKO4, it's right up in the top hero bar, you might have an FRC of 10. So what does that mean? So you guys might want to take a note on this or tell me if it's too complex. So 10,000, so a joule, right? So you have 10 kilojoules or you have 10,000 joules because a joule is, that's what it is, right? So 1 joule and is 10,000, the kilojoule is 1,000. So if you, a joule equals 1 watt. So you have a 10, you can sprint as hard as you can. Technically what it's saying is that you can sprint, if your Pmax, if your maximal sprint was 1,000 watts, you could sprint 1,000 watts for 10 seconds. 10,000 kilojoules burned. That's what it's telling you. Now, no one ever has a perfect 1,000-watt sprint, so the math isn't that easy. Plus, there's some other fatigue factors and things that happen in there. It's not that clean, but if you want to think about it, that's how you think about it. It really is the size of your anaerobic battery. The bigger that battery is, the longer and harder you can go over threshold. Once that battery is depleted, you rest. End of story. You have to rest. Now, we also have different recharge rates, something for future webinars, or if you watch my other webinars, I go deeper into, but FRC gives you the capacity of that anaerobic battery. What role does Pmax play with FRC? Pmax is the maximal burn rate. If Pmax is the max you can go, then that's the maximal rate you can burn through functional reserve capacity. And that's why we don't represent it in watts. It's represented typically in kilojoules because it's rating that. But you could sort of back into it. You have to watch some of the other webinars for that. I did get a question I missed that I wanted to go back. How can you distinguish a power spike from bad data? The reality is, with bad data, it's there is an equation. We can share a chart that shows you the data, the percentage off, but it's really hard to tell, right? If it's under 5%, if it's over 5%, it won't let the model calculate, so it'll point it out to you. If it's under 5%, there's a couple of just search data spikes, and you'll see there's some color coding and things like that that would show you which are the data spikes. In the end of the day, the athlete and the coach has to make the final call. And there's definitely now, even today, some I look at and I'm like, is that real? Could they have done that? Could they have not? In the end of the day, you get a couple that you just have to make that call. I tend to look at the second best performance and how close they've gotten to it. So Henry asked a question about Pmax. I'll ask too. So Henry, it's the single revolution of each foot. So technically it could be higher. So it could be higher than your because of what you're saying based on our cadence speed, it could be higher. But it's a model derived number. And you actually saw it in the example, it was higher in the model I had back there. So it could be higher. See there, it's actually higher. So it could be higher. I'm sorry, I did say that. It wasn't quite what I meant. Good catch. Sorry about that. It's good. You guys are paying attention. All right, everybody's awake. I like it. Okay. So that functional reserve capacity simply is the total amount of work that can be done during continuous exercise. But conceptually, it's a measure of fatigue resistance during high intensity, non-sustainable exercise. So how long can you burn that match? Well, that's related to how bright it is, how hot you're going, but the reality, it gives us insight into how long you can sustain it. There are much better examples. If you look through the webinar series for everybody, there's one there on building Pmax and FRC that goes deep with examples and shows you how to measure them and build them. FRC standards, again, I'm not going to go through them all, just kind of go to the medium. The range is 8.2 to 35.1. For men, 6.8 to 24.2 women. The medium range is about 13.5 to 22.7 for men and about 12.8 to 13.4 for women. Again, these might be a tad high because of our database being a little bit more pro than probably the actual universal mix, but it's just a guideline. It really is more about you. Modeled functionally threshold power, basically mFTP is the model-derived highest power a rider can maintain in a quasi-steady state without fatiguing. Threshold's been around for a long time. I'm not going to go into in-depth explanation. There also is a secondary webinar called Built in the Webinar List. And if anybody does not know where to find that list, I'm going to show you at the end of the webinar. But your modeled functional threshold power really is just, it's how long you can maintain a quasi-steady state without fatiguing. Typical standards here, men, the range is between 191. This is not weight driven. The problem was back in the day when we started collecting all our databases and stuff like that, we didn't have weight, so we never liked to mix apples and oranges, so we don't. So for men, we have 191 to 440 watts. For women, we have 173 to 316 watts. And then the medium range is 266 to 372 and 216 to 279. Most people probably quickly begin to see that our model, this is our database. We don't put this out publicly. We're just sharing it for the people that learn with us. Here you could probably see it's high. I would say at the FTP level, we're 25, 30 watts high on the average. Okay. Use of Pmax and FRC. I'm actually going to come back to that slide in a moment. I just want to go over some of the other definitions so we put it all together. Time to exhaustion, or TTE. So time to exhaustion is the maximum duration for which power equal to FTP can be maintained. And the reality is that's as opposed to the maximum duration FTP can be maintained for. So it's a little hard to understand, but it's actually easy to understand. The reality is, if you look at most people's, there's become this very driven mentality, right? Because it just, I can give you 1,000 reasons, but very quickly, you know, we went from, so FTP is a estimate of maximal lactate steady state, or lactate threshold. And even if you look at lactate threshold, there's two versions of that, right? So model functional threshold power, or functional threshold power, was meant to be a estimated, or a simple way to estimate your maximal lactate steady state, which is pretty much your LT. So the reality is, though, when you're generating that, most people can hold a maximal lactate steady state, or LT, and most of the literature points to these same time frames, somewhere between 30 and 70 minutes. But when these numbers first came out, Andy wrote a dialogue about that the simple way to test it is to test it for approximately an hour. And then that quickly became the definition. FTP is how hard you can ride for an hour. And the reality is that's not an exact truth. Again, classic example of the bell curve. It was the easiest answer, and we didn't have better data to prove it. Well, the reality is TTE is something that gives us an understanding of how long we can hold power equal, how long we can hold the maximum duration for which we can hold power equal to FTP. So the reality is that tells us the point where we start degrading off that FTP, and it's rarely at an hour. Now, it often tends to become sometime in that time range. I see a lot of 50 to 70 minutes. But the reality is you see them being much shorter, and is a very important metric to think about. So one of the examples I give in one of the webinars is, so I coach Amber Neben. Amber just won World's Time Trial Championships. People ask me all the time, how high did you raise her FTP, and how far out were you able to get her time to exhaustion? Well, to be honest with you guys, we really didn't focus on her FTP traditionally, like you would say it, nor did we focus on time to exhaustion beyond 38 minutes, because we knew that to win Worlds and Olympics, which was also, you know, where place she was trying to go, both of them would be under 38 minutes. So we were actually highly marking time to exhaustion, and we were driving as much power as we could, and then tracking that as what could be sustained at that ratio. So the reality is, when you start thinking about I hope you, for those of you that are new, and those of you experienced are probably already doing this, but are new, are starting to say, you know, I'm starting to understand there might be some interaction between these that really begin to be relevant. And it's, you know, and there is, and it's where I'm going to go with it all here shortly. So time to exhaustion gives us an insight of how long we can hold power equal to FTP. So instead of just using the generalized term, it's an hour, now we can understand how well we can sustain it. And then finally, we have stamina. And stamina is this, it really is a measure of resistance to fatigue during prolonged duration, moderate intensity, meaning sub-FTP exercise. Units are in percent of maximum, so 0 to 100%, although most individuals will fall in a 70 to 90% range. And really, this is measuring the degradation rate after FTP, after TTE. So, or after an hour, a rough estimate of an hour. And what it's saying you, if your stamina was 100%, you do not degrade. You never fatigue past that hour. And now, of course, we know that's not possible. So but it is an excellent measurement tool, Because the reality is if you were somebody competing in an Ironman or ultramarathon or marathon mountain biking or ultra events of any nature, stamina is a very important data metric for you because it's something that will rate your ability to go steady and long. As a matter of fact, the relationship between stamina and FTP is very important to you. So if you think about it, I'll just give you one example from this little picture I had. And if you watch the other webinars, when you go through the webinar series, particularly in this sense, I broke these down. Like I think I did how to build Pmax and FRC as one, and then how to build FTP, stamina, and TTE as another. So there are two different webinars in the series. What happens is, right, and remember this part, and I'll tell you this is one of the secrets of coaching, and again, better explained in other webinars. Whenever you train, right, train is a cost benefit. Training an athlete or as an athlete going through training, the reality is you're not lucky enough that you can just train and everything gets better. I mean, you could be that lucky, hang out and lay on your couch for about 3 years, do nothing, and then start training. And for a little while, everything will get better. But then the reality is, as you get into real training, as mFTP gets stronger, starts moving out, it's improving, Pmax might be getting smaller, and so might FRC, maybe even stamina. And then you're like, oh, crap, I forgot, we're doing some shorter racing. I need to raise that athlete's FRC and Pmax. So you start pushing those up, and suddenly FTP drops a lot. And stamina also drops maybe. And then you get to see this ongoing relationship with the cost benefit of specific training strategies. Now remember, and I know there's people here who just came over from WKO4, and I know whenever you have to go through change, it's frustrating and it can be hard. But the reality is, in WKO4, I'll give you a classic example why once you get through the learning curve, you have such a better tool. The only measurement you have is FTP and some specific MMP timeframes. Now you have all those MMP timeframes, everything else, and you have these human performance model metrics that if you use them over time, you look at cause and effect. I mean, you still have to know what training you were doing, but there's plenty of ways to see that in the diagnostic systems of WKO4. You begin to say, wow, this training, yeah, it raised their FRC, but it was too costly. Their FTP dropped too much. Or man, I know I needed a little more stamina, but I did that and their FTP was going down, and that's not what I wanted. I wanted those two to go up together. That's what you have to start thinking about. And that's it's one of the two most powerful upgrades you're going to get from WKO3 to WKO4. And I've watched coach and literally thousands of them go through it, where at first it's like, why can't I just have one number, FTP, it's easy. And then you start playing with it, and then you start watching it, and then you start going, wait a minute, when I do this, that happens. And I get this good effect and that bad effect. That's worthwhile. Or wait a minute, this other thing's happening too, and that makes it not worthwhile. And suddenly, before you know it, you're individualizing your coaching because you're not just looking at an athlete from one number on a bell curve. You're looking at them from a 360 degree, all the different ways they perform. And you're understanding your training stimuli, what you're predicting, what you're prescribing and inputting. Now you have a very rapid view of the response to that. So a question, stamina. So if you were to hold SST power for 2.5 hours, would that be world class? Yep, that'd be pretty strong. Anytime you're getting above like 85% in stamina, two things that tells me. One, you're probably a phenotype in the TTer style because you got to have a lot of slow twitch muscle to make that happen. And then above 85%, yeah, that's when you get above 80. I've seen, one or two or three pretty good triathletes get out to the 90 point. So you're getting pretty good. So that's a good overview of the science metrics. Now I had two topics on here as far as understanding individualization. You now have the 360 view. Now let's talk about this robust model and predicting levels. Or sorry, estimating levels. Oh, excuse me. All right, sorry. So driven by the power duration curve, the output of eye levels. So the introduction now is eye levels. I skipped a slide there, sorry. So new eye levels allows for the introduction of highly specific training that tracks and evolves around your fitness. So what is eye levels? Well, we go back to this classic idea of power, training levels, which I bet you everyone here, new or old, is very familiar with. And you've seen this chart. I'm not going to go over with. These are the classic 7 training levels that Andy built years and years ago, giving you insight into how hard to go and for different time lengths. And we always know that there's a relationship. I've taught this for years and years with the same thing. There's a relationship between the power and the time. So let's take a little look at WKO4. I'm going to show you something. If you haven't seen this, it's going to really show you how important the bell curve, breaking the bell curve is. So I just took the classic zones from 2 different riders. And they have similar FTPs. So, which I'm going to show you, I forget exactly what they are, but it's going to show up here on the screen. This is the power duration curve of rider 1. And all I did was put the classic Coggin training levels, I just put lines where they belong on the axis that shows power. And as you can see, this axis 155 is the lowest number here, and it's going up to about 800. So normally when we see curves and we see this power and we see power levels and trends, if you'd ever notice, we tend to change the axis we're looking at to better represent everything as a nice little square. So what if I took a second rider who was different but had a similar threshold, second rider that was different but had a similar threshold, and instead of letting the axis here change, I froze it, which I can now do, and I made it show the same minimal and maximal values. Well, there's a second rider. So about a 10 watt difference in threshold, but you can kind of quickly see, right, they look pretty different. And not only do they look pretty different, and there's a slight change in the minimum and the maximum here because I zoomed it in, but I'll make them show closer, but realize you're talking 50 watts. Look how differently their power duration curve actually passes through the training zones. Look how kind of slow, much slower this rider's edges through the VO2 max and classic threshold zone and then drops off. And look how this rider kind of more crashes right through, right? Has a short plateauing, then just keeps crashing. So it wouldn't be hard for you to guess, here's more of a time trialist, here's more of a sprinter. So the reality is, right, if you look at those with those kind of fixed realities, if I try to just lay them side by side to give you some insight, you can see that there's some dramatic differences in the way these go through different zones. A lot of people have never realized that because technically these 2 examples are close enough, you'd basically be prescribing the same training levels. And if you use this idea of training levels, then you were doing that. So you had those 2 riders who produced power dramatically differently, generally training at the same levels. So we designed eye levels to solve that problem. And what eye levels are is they're based on the power duration curve. And it's not a revolution, it's just a simple evolution of individualization. So in this model, the old model, FTP has been the anchor of all training levels. All training levels described or efforts were based off a percentage of FTP and training levels that estimated a best time and zone. Well, now we've created new Coggin eye levels, and we've given you some additional levels to be a little more descriptive. We know, the reality is we didn't want to be too confusing here. We didn't want to add more complexity than was worthwhile. But on the same side, when you start getting above anaerobic, you have a lot of things going on. And understanding how that plays, we felt was important. So this chart, and again, you can get this, pull this out of the handouts so you can have this chart, shows you how the old, classic, and the new relate. And the reality is this is an idea, and if you watch some of the webinars I'm talking about, you'll see intensive versus extensive. So when we look at training target, we're talking about extensive aerobic and intensive aerobic for all your aerobic training. And for your anaerobic, we're doing the same, anaerobic endurance and anaerobic power. So the reality is it's just 2 energy systems being split into multiple ways to achieve the best. So you're talking about, I'm sorry, I could have done that while I went. So now let's look at how that actually plays out. if I looked at rider 1, if I looked at their Coggin Classic power levels versus their Coggin individual power levels, I begin to see something interesting. So, I think this slide has a typo on it. I think I mixed the two models, which I meant to fix. I did. So the reality is what you're seeing here is this athlete, and you guys are going to see the slight mistake in here, but I'll point it out when I'm done. But I'll still make the dramatic example. If you look at this athlete, because remember, rider 1 and rider 2 both had similar thresholds. Here they were doing over threshold work. You really had this one range, 254 to 290, and then anything above 290. Where in your individualized power levels, it's more unique. Here we have FRC at 241 versus 355, FR 355 to 522, Pmax FRC, we want to start doing more of the neuromuscular power, 522 to 690, and we have time ranges for those. Of course, the longer time range correlates with the lower power number. So not only have we improved the individualization, and it actually matches, it's based on your power duration curve. Rider 2 sees a dramatically different game. So Rider 2 has, you look at their VO2 max. Remember, it was the same. So imagine if Rider 2, the person who had the sprint going off the screen, they would have been prescribed to sprint, to do their anaerobic work at 290 watts. Here, you have prescriptions going, their FRC, which is, FRC is your anaerobic battery or your W or your anaerobic capacity. Here, because it's recognizing their individual curve, it's actually giving me a much more appropriate range, 404 to 708 watts. So under the old system, that sprinter going off the screen, and we used to call them normalized power busters. And you might have, as all coaches, you have one or two people who have always done this. They bust that level, and it just creates oddities, and they don't fit. Now there's no more busters like that because the individual eye levels pick that up. The individual eye levels are based off the power duration curve, and that power duration curve updates every day, which I'm going to get into in one or two more final slides. So now if I looked at these two athletes on, their power levels, you can see, even though they have similar thresholds, look at the difference in the variations on their above threshold power training, both in power and recommended times, because it's also recognizing that curve moving through the levels and giving us insight into the amount of time at that level the athlete needs to get adaptation. That combination is really important if you think about it, and think about how much the eye level opens the door to really individualize training. And think about the two tools you're about to put together. I got one more slide, so then I'll close it with a two-tool speech. So if you think about the benefit of eye levels, they're specific and individualized to you or your individual athlete. You could have 20 athletes and rarely ever have exactly the same above threshold. Now, the reason we didn't individualize threshold and below, you're going to ask me this question, we analyzed thousands and thousands and thousands of files, and guess what? It doesn't, the percentages of change there are really, really low. Threshold and below, we all as humans perform in a very tight range, and it's in that same build FTP. I show you Andy's studies on it, and it's pretty interesting how close it is. It's really once we get above threshold does the variation get really big, as you were saying. So there wasn't any reason to make it more complex and individualize that. Also understand that eye levels immediately incorporates micro changes. So you know how now you might be testing once every 4 to 6 weeks, hopefully, and a lot of us might be testing every 8. Well, now, as you know, athletes as they're training, they go through those phases where suddenly it's like, man, your FTP is on the move. You're just getting more and more fit, right? Well, eye levels, because it's driven by the power duration curve, driven by mean maximal power, picks that up on any given change. So every time the athlete has a little breakthrough in performance, that gets picked up by the power duration curve, that gets picked up by the eye levels, and those eye levels are reset tomorrow to make sure you're continuously training at the right level and right durations. So think about what I just said for those of you that are new. That means these are dynamic. They're updating with your athlete fitness. Instead of waiting 4 weeks till you test and then be like, yeah, I knew it, And then you in the back of your mind might be saying, yeah, I could have had them working harder for 2 or 3 weeks. But the reality was you didn't see it till you test it. You couldn't be sure till you test it. Now you have a model doing it every day, which also reduces the burden on formal testing. You also now have a specific understanding of the relationship of time of intensity. And finally, it's automagic. Simply the software does all the work for you. So I'm going to go to Q&A for now. In that, I'm going to also, while I'm doing Q&A, show you something I should have had lined up on the web behind me, and I can answer any questions you guys have. I know there's some new players here, so I'd be glad to answer them. One question I got about the eye levels is, what's the best way to communicate these eye level durations to my athletes? More of a business workflow topic. Yeah, Kenneth, it's a great question. What I do is do it by screenshot, but I actually just prescribe that way. So I just prescribe that way. And it's the best. I use it for my knowledge. It's part of my secret weapon, right? When you're coaching athletes, it gives me greater insight. So, and if you watch some of the other webinars about building FTP and the ones that I'm talking about, and I'll show you the list here in a moment, I give you really deep insight in how to do that. So Matthew asks, does WKO4 update the FTP setting of my Garmin when I sync it? It does not. You can sync these eye levels to your Garmin. So just Google search. If you have I think it's an 820 or 1000. Garmin does use the Cog eye levels, and you can sync them. Just Google search how to do it. They did a nice video how-to online, and it's also in our how-tos online. So if you want your eye levels, these target numbers, to be on your Garmin, you can just sync WKO4 with your Garmin and it will work. Henry points out the 520 does it too. Cool. So that's a good answer there. Other help resources, and I'm going to have to open a browser here to show you this. So if you go to Training Peaks, and you could just look at these. I should have been smarter and shared them in advance. But you can go to Training Peaks and just go to the WKO4 section, and then under there, I might as well navigate it. You have information. You have WKO4 education on the bottom. That brings you to our education center. There's a WKO4 tutorial. There's how-to videos. So the how-to videos are like, how do I build a chart? How do I add a name? How do I close this part of the screen? They're short, like 2 to 5 minute videos on individual functions. And then here's a whole list of webinars and seminars which show coaching functions. I'm going to come back to this in a second. There's ebooks that Andy and I have been writing. I'm trying to write more. We're going to get more in here. Here's a place to find our articles. And here's a list of all upcoming webinars. Oh, there's an interval webinar coming up that's not on here yet. Oh, make sure that goes up tomorrow. You can at any given time go to all of the past webinars. So it's a Training Peaks. This is on our YouTube. This is a playlist. For those of you that were interested in some of the individualization, these are in a semi-good order to watch. Some of these there's sometimes some redundancy in the individualization or understanding, but we still put them up there for people who want to watch. Here's training with Pmax, FRC, and stamina metrics, the original one. There's power behind cyclocross, building functional threshold, power and stamina. So building Pmax and functional reserve. For most of the questions you were asking here, if you guys watch 11 and 12, that'll answer a lot of your questions about those new metrics and how to build them. I got a lot of questions about how to. I just kind of ducked them because these webinars will give you excellent insight. How to review a season. Here's one on running with power for those of you using Stride or other similar devices. There's one on individualizing intervals. All kinds of interesting stuff here for coaching. Again, that's accessed from this page. Now, if you wanted to figure out, here's our how-to videos. If you want to figure out how to build a time range, how to download a device, how to analyze power, that's there. And also when you're working within WKO4, there is a help section here. So you can always look through the help section. Always make sure you're on the most recent update. You should be, I think you guys are on 342. I think I have that here. There is expression guides and user guides. You can always click on the user guides And the user guide manual can be found here on, this is our Zendesk program. You can download the PDF. That's a pretty extensive user guide, pretty deep. Lots of stuff in there. Most people watch the videos, to be honest, but some people are readers, so they want to read the user guide. So lots of help and support in that way. And of course, you know, you can always submit tickets to the help function. At the bottom of any Training Peaks page, if you go to Training Peaks, the home page, you can always submit a ticket here. If something's confusing or you're having a hard time doing something, just click on Submit a Ticket. And in the category, you can just scroll down to see WKO. Okay, any final questions? Excellent. Any of the coaches that have just switched over, I would also highly suggest you join the WKO4 Facebook group. You can get good help and support there. Please, you know, ask the base questions. That group is about learning and with power more than about how do I click on this, but you'll still tend to get answers. But if you can just go in there and search for stuff, it's an excellent resource. Jump right in if you want. All right, everybody, thanks for joining us. Good luck. Feel free to ask questions and hope to see you on another webinar soon. Good night now.